Thanks, Caroline. I can see that you've started the recording, and when you're ready for us to kick off, you can share the screen. So
I have started, so you can't see my shared screen.
Let me check my screens. There we are. I was too busy looking at everyone's faces and names. It's so exciting to be here with you all today. Thank you so much for joining us. This is one of many events, many really wonderful events in the Sustainable Living Festival platform for 2021. We miss seeing you all together with us in our usual space in Melbourne in the CBD. But the upside here is that everyone is able to join us from all across the country. So this has been a very low emissions event compared to our normal ones. It's great to see so many people still coming along to share in the conversation. So Caroline, we're going to have another go at the visuals and go back to the start.
Right.
Thank you. I think it might be flicking through automatically for us. It's Saturday morning and we're feeling forgiving. Yeah. So this is the Sustainable Living Festival event, as I said, and we're joined today with support from the Architects Institute of Australia, Architects Declare, and some very exciting guests that I'm about to introduce to you. The framing for the conversation today asks us to consider the Living Building Challenge premise that a world full of compact, connected communities with healthy rather than inhumane levels of density inherently conserve natural resources that support human health and farmlands while inviting natural systems back into the daily fabric of our lives. As these previously disturbed areas are restored, the trend is reversed and nature can again bring us together. Caroline,
sorry.
We're just rolling through this. I'm joining you today from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And again, for those of you who are just joining us, we have a live chat function. So please do pop into the chat the lands on whom you are dialing in from. And I invite you to join me in sharing your respects for those elders that are past and present and those emerging. We can move from the slide now, Caroline. And we're joined today by 4 really exciting speakers. I'm Heidi Lee. I'm the CEO of Beyond Zero Emissions. And in a previous life, I really enjoyed working in architecture and urban design for about 20 years before I moved into a climate change focused role here at Beyond Zero Emissions. And we're joined today by, and I'm going to get the order of these introductions slightly out, Stephen Glacken, a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Urban Transitions, Peter Hurst, experienced architect and town planner, which I think is wildly underselling Peter's achievements. We have Paul Ha, who is an experienced architect. I can't believe these bios are getting reduced. Paul Ha received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Architecture Sustainability Group just last year, and it is a small representation of the enormous achievements of his career. And Caroline Pidcock, an experienced architect again, a winner of many awards, Architects Declare spokesperson and the chair of the board of 1 Million Women. If you're interested in finding out the full breadth of the field that we're presented with today, please do check out the website where more informative bios are presented for you. So today we're asking each of our speakers to present to us a couple of slides and a short story, bringing to life this central question that we're here today to explore: how and why local matters. We're going to start with, and now I have to guess again,
Paul Ha.
Paul Ha. Thank you, team effort. Collaboration is what nature does best, and here we are today exemplifying that. Paul, we're over to you for your 2 to 3 minute intro, and then we'll roll through to the others. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. I think we can all agree that tackling our climate and biodiversity emergency, or addressing our living building challenge, it's about harnessing personal responsibility and community action and good governance for re-loving the earth. And I reckon the best way to do this is with creative action that not only builds place, but also builds people. So both individually and collectively in local community. These days, our dominant economic paradigm is in guarded, highly regulated and globally competitive delivery of products and services. And we architects and planners, we play into this big time when we birth monuments and cities in our name. It's a paradigm that disables local community. I like to think that all of us can together, locally and actively, engage in designing and constructing our buildings, in growing our food, in caring for our sick and elderly, in rewilding our open spaces, and in advocating for better governance within and beyond our domain. So, with a vibrant culture for local living, professionals like me, we can shift our role and our gaze from one of solutions delivery to one of sharing expertise with our client community. And if that's done locally, our community then moves to the centre of rich, collaborative and enabling creative process, which is where it should be. So thanks. Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the questions that come to you from that introduction. And I really invite people to consider what engaged and rich and empowered communities might look like and what Paul's experiences are in bringing them to life already. Our next speaker is Peter Hurst. A slide here for your viewing pleasure. Over to you, Peter.
Okay, mine does go for 3 minutes, so I timed it out. So I don't want to read too quickly, but my issue is on urban sprawl and how local urban issues and urban sprawl related. The density of housing in the most suitable locations is the most significant contribution to containing urban sprawl, which is a major factor in a sustainable future environment. Yes, developer pressure and rate-seeking councils contribute to this almost unfettered sprawl, but so does the planning system. And the failure of bureaucracy to manage their responsibility of land use planning by not developing land use plans which follow the fundamental environmentally sustainable design rules. The Garden City movement, developed by Ebenezer Howard in the late 19th century, is actually a manifestation of how villages and towns have been formed when walking was the mode of transport. Such a process applies today. Analyse the land to determine the best use locations. For example, best market garden land should not be developed for housing. Model development around activity nodes. Develop a hierarchy of activity nodes. Contain residential development to within walking distance of local nodes, schools, shops, parkland. Provide higher densities to suit older people, single younger couples over and around the nodes to support business development 24/7. Reduce residential densities progressively from the centre so that the periphery of the residential precinct has the largest lots and lowest densities. In following these principles, we will create an environment where travel time is reduced, walkability is improved, living amenity enhanced, and housing diversity prevails. And the extent of affordable housing should be increased. And we move together towards a sustainable environment. Paraphrasing the US President, JFK, ask not what planning can do for you, ask what you can do for planning. Picking on Paul's comment about consultative approaches, consultative planning enables the fleshing out of the planning scheme from simple zoning into subzones where higher densities should be located. Similarly, as design outcomes are considered critical to the community, then these design criteria be developed, consulted, refined and adopted. This should mean where a development complies with such criteria, planning permit is no longer required. If the planning permit stage is deleted, holding costs, appeal costs will be gone and development costs reduced with the potential for lower cost housing. The major stumbling block for inner urban and middle urban development has been the protraction and cost of the adversarial planning permit process. Community consultation in advance to establish development criteria will give certainty to landowner, to neighbour and developer, and the process will be more cost efficient, and we will move towards diverse density of development responsive to the location within which they exist. This will stop the pressure for housing on the fringe of the cities and towns and should curtail urban sprawl, because affordable housing, smaller lot size and smaller house sizes are available in a range of places throughout the metropolis. Planning in and with community by the planning authorities and individuals subjugating selfish wishes toward a land use and development control plan for the greater good bring about planned community, and with this, a more environmentally sustainable settlement pattern.
I'm feeling like there was a very emphatic full stop there, so I'm going to come in. That's right. Thank you so much, Peter. I am all for it, and I want to hear some really great questions about a pretty bold idea. Let's eliminate planning permit process for all the reasons that you're talking about. And I'll add a pet peeve of mine here, that we are still describing affordable housing as different to housing. We should just have housing, folks. There shouldn't be the affordable type and the unaffordable type. So let's move straight on from there to Stephen Glacken. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Hi guys, I've got a demolition across the road, so it's a bit noisy, so be it. This is the website for greening the Greyfields. It's greyfields.com.au if you want to check out the stuff. So about 10 years ago, Peter Newton, my professor, came up with this idea that urban sprawl is ridiculous. Most of the development is actually happening in infill, like middle suburbs, where it's not producing that many more houses. So let's get landowners together and start to redevelop a precinct so we get better dwellings, denser dwellings, greater walkability, all that sort of stuff. So the project started with creating a load of software to show where redevelopment was going to happen, what houses were going to be bulldozed. Great. No one listened because there was no statutory mechanism, there was no community engagement, there was no housing design. So we spent about the last 8 years looking at the statutory requirements for change, engaging with community members, doing whole of local government and whole of state government workshops to try and figure out what areas need to change, what do they need in terms of community co-benefit, what will the community want, what sort of bits and pieces, like will they need to get them over that NIMBYist attitude towards change. Like I work a lot in Marimba, they want to keep the trees. Okay, let's come up with super lots. Let's like get 4 or 5 lots together. Keep the trees, put all the buildings in the centre, central massing, increase walkability, keep the trees, have additional flood mitigation and so forth. All these ideas are grand, but the biggest issue that I've had getting all of this through is the statutory regulation. So you can do the feasibilities of your designs, you can work well with the community. Community knows what they want, and if they want an area to be greener, it doesn't take much to get them going. The actual main issue I've found is the statutory regulations. So we've spent probably about 3 years now knocking all that up, and we're in the process of going through the advertising and doing the community engagement for it now. A bit of resistance to it, but the playbooks that we've created allow people to basically pick up the playbook, go speak to the neighbours, see if they want to sell together, and start this process of creating precincts. But the statutory aspect is the bit that keeps locking us down, and hopefully we'll get some change when that moves to implementation. That's it.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think that we've got lots of questions anyway in the back of our minds there about what the capacity for this design approach is to be able to help us, reconsider what our local communities might actually look like. Looking forward to question time. Our last presenter, Caroline Pidcock, take it away.
Okay, sorry about this, but I shouldn't be ever charged with running with controlling the screen. I'd like to just start by also acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and I'm meeting in Gringai land up in northern New South Wales today, and really pay respect to their continuing culture, community, land, sea and sky. I think that we have so much to learn from our traditional custodians about how we need to reconnect ourselves with nature and be at one, and therefore respect the places in which we live in that way. So what I would really like you to do is to actually close your eyes. Everyone online, please close your eyes for a minute, for 30 seconds. Now, what I'd like you to do is think about a place that brings you enormous pleasure and restoration. I'd like you to be thinking about, you know, how it affects your senses. What does it smell like? What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are you feeling? You know, are you feeling like at the moment there's this petrichor, of this smell of petrichor from rain around me? What are you tasting? And how does it impact you? And I'd just like you to really sort of go into that place and just think about what it is about that place that is bringing you that joy and that sort of sense of restoration and gorgeousness. Now you can open your eyes again. Now I'm going to hazard a guess that a lot of the places that you might have just gone to in your mind had a lot of nature involved, possibly water, possibly trees, possibly rivers, possibly all sorts of beautiful aspects of nature. And I would like to sort of suggest that why do we only sort of think of these places as somewhere where we go to? Why don't we make our current places, like everywhere we live and work, like that? Why don't we make these places those joyous, restorative, beautiful places? And I think that we as architects and planners and built environment specialists need to hone our skills to doing that. I think that that is where our creative energy needs to be focused, is to bring that sense of joy and delight that we go to for holidays. That it's like the Sunday, you know, the best crockery we bring out on, or some people bring out for guests. Actually, we should be bringing it out and enjoying it every day. And similarly, our built environments need to sort of embed that beauty and joy and wonder that makes our body, not only makes our bodies good, but it sort of is good for nature as well. And I'm sort of suggesting that maybe what we need to do is focus on a global sense, being a combination of local issues in a globally connected network. And I think that what we need to do is tend and mend, renew and regenerate. So we need to tend to the problems that we are finding, not knock them down and rebuild, but tend to them. Look at how we can mend those problems and make better, be they buildings, be they streets, or whatever part of our built environment. Renew where they need to be renewed, and then set it up so that we are able to regenerate not only ourselves, but our built environments and nature as well. So on that moment, I'll stop sharing and we can start the discussion, and Heidi can take over again. Great.
I love the sense. So basically you're in my safe hands now, folks. You can send me questions directly in the chat and I can ask them for you. You can share them in the chat directly and I will help steer our conversation so that we get to hear a little bit more, dig a little bit deeper into each of the compelling ideas that these wonderful presenters shared with us this morning. So Paul spoke to us about consultative processes and rich and thriving communities. Peter, not to diminish this to one thing, but I'm very interested in eliminating planning permits, having spent years of my life waiting for them to be assessed. Stephen, looking at greening the Greyfields. And Caroline, I'm gonna put yours at like tend, mend, renew, and regenerate. I loved hearing that. So for this, I'll warm us up by asking a little bit more about, now, Peter, Ebenezer Howard, garden cities, walkability. What is your position that sustainable design would be better achieved by waiving planning permits when projects, you know, can't comply with the adopted performance measures and stuff? Tell us more about that particular aspect, because I think we're doing some people out of a job here, but we're also making things a lot easier. And you're saying it's going to give us a better outcome. Can you tell us a little more?
Well, one of my concerns is that as a planner or some part of the team, that I do think at times we're not getting the movement forward because planners in the legal field who specialise in the legal field never existed 30 years ago, or one or two of them did, and now it's a massive industry. And I think planners too have, it's against their own fee base to have a consultative approach. My issue isn't about doing away with planning permits. My issue is firmly that I think we have to have improved standards. We have to protect people's amenity, overlooking and overshadowing. But we establish those criteria in advance, in consultation. And once those issues are agreed, people can move forward. Building envelopes on a site, there's nothing new. Ebenezer Howard, my wife, she heard me, just practice the talk last night. She said, Peter, a lot of this is old hat. It is old hat. But nobody's enacting it. Nobody's following it through. It's not being implemented. The issue is that if we discuss those issues in community first, the framework is established, then if people can, if the developer, the owner, the person who wants to do the building complies with those constraints of a 7 metre height or a 1.5 metre from a boundary or something, fine. They get a tick and it goes straight ahead. And a developer, if they're looking at 7 units on a site, if it says there's 1 per 250 square metres and he cites 750 square metres, they can fit 3. If he wants to fit 4, well, there's the issue that comes up. So it's just seemingly simplistic how we can go about it. If we establish those criteria in a logical, sensible framework, and there's a difference between building in West Melbourne as distinct from building in Camberwell, building in an area where there's all the terraces are lined up against the boundaries, and so setbacks and heights on boundaries are nonsense. But you establish that. And that's the major thing. And I think there's a lot of our planning permits and development process which is curtailed. But as I said, the big thing is that we want to have, and I think architects know and how to increase the densities, in urban areas. But it's just these constraints that are confronting them. And so while they're not producing them, or their developments are costing more because of the high cost of planning permits, we're getting people saying, no, I'll move to the fringe. I'll move to the fringe. So yeah, I just think it, as I said, it's common sense. It's old hat. Let's start to implement it. And I think let's overcome. Are the planners not arguing it strongly because they'll be out of specialist consultant work? Are the legal people saying, gee, if we get an approach which isn't as adversarial, I'm out of work, so they have no reason to argue the case? Whatever it is, we're not achieving it, and our environment's being knocked about as a consequence.
So I thank you. That's a really thorough response. And one thing that it brings up for me, because there are no questions coming in the chat yet, one of the things it brings up for me then is around talking about it old hat. And often when I think of well, how do you solve a current problem that seems like it's kind of self-made, we tend to look as designers to nature and to Indigenous wisdom. And Paul, I know that you have done some work on community-based housing processes in rural and remote Indigenous communities. And I wonder if there's anything that you can share out of what you've learnt through that process that you think might help us move through this dilemma that we're facing around how to create these local communities now in our cities with what we're starting from today.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. Yeah, look, definitely doing things locally for certainly the projects that I was involved in up north, it was really fundamental, and yet it was at odds with the mainstream model of government handout housing that was delivered from afar. And it's also a model which so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families had waited on without fruit for decades upon decades. And we were using materials straight out of the bush, so earth and stone and crushed anthill, pole timbers, bamboo. And we adopted construction methods that were suited to the local available community workforce. So they were from the community, men, women and kids, and they all had really vastly different amounts of energy and strength and skill and free time. So these approaches with materials and with labour, they were absolutely crucial to making home ownership even remotely possible for these Indigenous communities in those parts of the world. And obviously that culture of participatory design and of self-building, it mustered lots of practical skills, and it heightened individual and collective pride, and it gave communities courage also to then start other small enterprises and things like commercial fishing, market gardening, bread baking, forestry, things like that. It was a terrific time. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for sharing. And I'm not sure, Nadine, if we've organised prizes, but if we have, one for Grace for issuing the first question in the chat. Before I get to Grace's question, I did want to weave this into Stephen. I think that you're also dealing with, in a way, your approach and focus on the Greyfield sites is also dealing with a short-term historical investment that we've made, either as individuals or as community, in facilities that we don't need anymore. The Greyfield development. So we're saying that this, in its current form, doesn't serve the purpose that we need right now. So can you draw a link for us here between the Greyfield site work that you're doing and how we can actually expand on this through perhaps the collaborative participatory development, or around the planning opportunities? Can you help to weave these together in how they impact your work?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the stuff that we've done speaks directly to what Peter was saying. So you're getting this fragmented infill that's moving through every suburb like a virus. Every year or two, another house on the street gets subdivided and so on. So what we're looking at is a future of Melbourne that's basically all concrete, and it's a pretty crappy outcome. It seems intuitive that something like getting 2 or 3 lots together and building something better would be good, but statutory planning doesn't allow it. And it's an absolute nightmare going through that jungle. The holding costs would kill any project. So what we tried to do was that community aspect, sorry about the noise, that community aspect, you figure out what's feasible within the community, what they want, create a nice overlay. Once that overlay is done, no third party, no one can complain anymore. That's it. Once you build what the community wants to build, chuck in a bit of cash for something additional, done. Now, in the manuals that we've made, the playbooks which are on that website, there's one for landowners, there's one for developers, and there's one for municipalities. We tell you how to go and do it. So Maroondah are doing it now. They've got tube sites. We've been working a little bit with Knox, a little bit with Whitehorse. I want to start working with Footscray a bit, to get people out there, to get the planners to speak to the locals, see what the locals want, figure out what the key policy objectives are of the municipality and the state, see if you can bring them together so everyone gets a win. Developers get more cash, community gets what it wants, you get better dwellings, better outcomes, and you get that sort of greeny precinct. So I guess a micro version of that Garden City idea, but it's just cannot keep going with small lot subdivision. It's making the city smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's going to be way too expensive to buy back. So we should be thinking more precincty. Did that answer the question?
I feel like it does. I mean, you were invited to weave things together, so I think you responded to the invitation really well. Thank you. I'm going to go to Grace's question. Grace, our winner of perhaps no prize, but no less a winner for submitting the first question. You're saying to me here that we've lost some of the hard lessons about urban density that people of the 19th century learned. We're now moving backwards. Is it short-term thinking that allows poor forms to be brought, to life? I'm just going to remind people gently, if you're not already on mute, if you pop yourself on mute, that'll help with some of the feedback coming through. So with this position, is it actually some of the short-term thinking that is stopping us from achieving really great local urban outcomes? And I think we'll invite Peter to respond to this. As well as, Peter, two-part question. So I'm going to weave in Noy's question here as well about, she's observing you've presented the automatic permit system, but is there anything else within our current planning system that prevents us from achieving some of the goals that you're talking about? So I'll invite Peter to respond. Off mute. You can come off mute. Everyone else on mute. Peter off mute.
Pressing the wrong button. I think the first point about how the densities were achieved. I've got one of my youngest daughter lives over in London, Bromley, about 20k out of London, and you walk in the town centre of Bromley, and there are 5-storey buildings built in the 1800s, 17 and 1800s, and then the densities spread down from there, still much higher densities than we have here. I think Stephen's last comment about how he's working within communities, we've got to move, I suppose we've got to move incrementally. I suppose the ideal that I have, I mean, but we don't have greenfield sites to get the ideal, but we've got to work within our system to get these densities. It's still why, and that's even Paul's comment about the community has to come to terms with what their responsibilities are for the environment and then move forward within buildings. I'm saying the same in planning. They have to forget their selfish wishes of not wanting X or Y. I suggest one of the major reasons we're not getting, or we're getting a lot of objections in planning schemes, they don't want it happening beside them, but they don't want it precluded from the scheme, so that when they reach my age and when they want to shift or downsize, they want the opportunity that their single residential block can have 5 units on it or 6 units on it. So I just think we've got to, that's where planning principle and good governance has to stand above these selfish, not in my backyard issues. And again, I am very much in favour of control or control, community consultation towards guidance of development. And when people want to push the limits, they still have a planning permit. There is a reason for that system, but we're just not managing it correctly at the moment. And I think, I don't know, we've got to move out of it. And you say, what influences? It does require going back to the base principles and saying, what do we need in our community? Looking at the base principles and the modelling that comes up, which obvious is sensible, you know, to have the densities in a hierarchical fashion spreading from the centre out, and you work towards that model. I'm against one of the, I'm averse to dual occupancies anywhere, because I think they breach that the privacy of your backyard in that sense. Whereas, and I think they take away from densities, the right densities in the right locations. We have it. There will be a set percentage of people who will want to live in apartments or in higher density, and everyone you do in the wrong location, 800 metres away from the railway station, 5 units are sitting there. The people aren't going to walk to the station from 800 metres. You're stopping that development that's happening over the railway station, where when they're ready to shift into that, they're downstairs, don't need the car, walk to the shops, make the shopping centre a more vital space after 5 o'clock at night. So I think it's a case of people divesting themselves of just selfish interests, as well as the system reforming.
Thanks, Peter. I'm hearing a theme about moving from a selfishness or an individual interest to really a collective benefit and collective well-being. I like Kim's question here, which is directed to Caroline, and I'm going to invite both Caroline and Paul to respond to this idea here. So Kim is talking about regional Victoria, Castlemaine, specifically where density is already low. So Caroline, Kim and I, and many of us here, are inspired by your notion of building and designing in a way that connects us with nature. And do you have examples of this working well that you can share with us? Can you just tell us about some of the barriers and opportunities for success? And perhaps if there were examples from regional areas, there'd be ones we'd love to hear from. So I'll invite Caroline to respond, and maybe Paul can share some examples as well.
Well, I've actually just myself bought a little place in regional New South Wales in Dungog, and particularly because I think this is a really important question, and I think that part of the way that we need to think about populating, you know, dealing with the increasing populations is not just to jam them all into the cities, but to help enrich some of the local, the regional areas, and help people have slightly less dense, but still dense enough places where they can get around. So I'm in the middle of exploring that. But I think if you say how to, you know, where are things being reconnected with nature, I think they're happening all over the place. And I think Paul's example is a more local one and probably regional, and I think he can speak to that. But I mean, I just am thinking of that place in Seoul where they pulled out a huge, a great big freeway through the center of town and rediscovered their river in the middle of it, and people would, you know, the mayor was going to be sacked for ruining the place, etc. And now it's just the best place, and everyone has realized what a gorgeous thing. I mean, if you look over to Paris, they're about to bring nature and people and back into the Champs-Élysées and the Arc de Triomphe, and sort of reduce the impact of cars. And I just think that will be a glorious and wonderful solution. In Sydney at the moment, there's a lot of taking away car spots and putting people into outside spaces post-COVID because people want to go out, but they don't want to necessarily be inside. And that's right in nature. I think that, you know, possibly one of the best outcomes from a terrible year last year is that understanding that we need to be outside. It's really good for us, and we need to work out how our cities can adapt and adjust to nature. And what are the barriers? I think part of the big barrier is that people have been disenfranchised from their power in demanding that and saying we need more nature. That is a bigger right and a more important thing than cars. And and I suppose a big part of that is the whole time thing. People think that we've got to get from A to B as fast as possible. And I think that we all need to kind of adjust our thinking about how we live and think more carefully about that movement is a good thing and that we can enjoy it, and it doesn't have to be super fast. I mean, I know that's idealistic, but gosh, we've all got to be idealistic, I think.
Thank you. I think that we should stay idealistic and just create and dream a future that we know we have to have, and then just like get on with making it. Paul, have you got an example to share on the same theme here, like building and designing in a way that reconnects us with nature, and perhaps examples of like regional communities where you think this has happened? Oh no!
Yeah,
great.
Yeah, Heidi, I think it's really interesting. The thought about, like my interest in engaging locally, both whether you're living in the city or whether you're living in the country, and also trying to get really nice, environmentally responsible and socially just connections between city and country, without just growing the city right through into the country with urban sprawl, as Peter's advocating strongly against. And I'll just maybe give a quick example, just with regard from my own experience, just as it relates to trees and timber and wood, which I like using as an architect. But what's really striking is that, to me, is that the Australian building industry, it really now relies on a truly global timber supply chains, and the environmental and the social standards that underlie the forest management, they're really quite devastating. And so it's really refreshing for me to see small farmers in country areas of Victoria, and I know there's a very terrific one in Dungog, Carolyn, as well, in New South Wales. And they're located within a stone's throw of the bigger cities sometimes, often, and they're beginning to harvest fast-grown native and exotic trees that they planted in the 1980s and the 1990s, or rehabilitating farmland. And then they went and form pruned them and thinned them and high pruned them, and now they've got themselves some really high-quality architectural timber. And they've often done, in Victoria certainly, they've often done this on steep and degraded and previously cleared land, and it turned out to have limited agricultural value for other purposes. And then back in Melbourne, there's a social enterprise at Ceres, which you may know, it's called Ceres Fair Wood. And what it does, it aggregates this local farm timber, as well as the wood from urban tree salvage. So trees that have to come down, that are dying in parks or make way for roads. And it sells this timber to a discerning market. So it's to a green demographic, that cares a lot about where materials and building projects, materials for the building projects are sourced. And so this Fair Wood, it connects the city people with small Victorian tree farmers and sawmillers, and they're geographically dispersed and otherwise, and they struggle to find, sell and deliver to a market that's going to really appreciate the farm-grown wood that they've got on offer. And so then also Fair Wood will then supply to building and landscape contractors and furniture makers and DIYers, both in the city and the country. And it does that to the highest standards of environmental and social responsibility. And it can build friendships through this too. So really connecting city and country folk, and it'll encourage these farming families to replant a lot of bare paddocks that we see all around in the landscape in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland. And they do that both for conservation and profit. And I guess what I'm trying to sort of suggest to you is that when you have small, local, community-based enterprises like this, they can be replicated many times over, and they can serve cities and they can serve nations. And they can do that without those devastating environmental footprints and the social injustice and that opacity that's attached to global supply chains. And I reckon these little enterprises, they can help to create those ties that bind us for a resilient future. And it's a future that I think it's one in which local is really going to matter. So, thanks, Heidi. Yeah.
Thank you. And Caroline, you gave me the wave of, I have something more to add.
I was just thinking that what Paul is describing is exactly what a regenerative outcome, or one of the many regenerative outcomes is where you find the energy and the understanding of what the local systems, and allow it to express itself. And from that, you find many different and locally relevant but globally connected outcomes. And I think that's what a regenerative future looks like. It isn't sort of stamping the same thing over wherever, regardless of where you are. It's about sort of helping create frameworks within which local energies and interests can find a bit of a structure and then realize their own thing. And then if we can connect them, then there's that greater possibility of enablement, which is kind of really exciting. And, I agree that it's got to be locally relevant.
Thank you. And I wanted to offer with this as well, the story that you tell, Paul, about Series Fair Wood, I think is really compelling. And I was talking to one of the suppliers to the Series Fair Wood project yesterday, and he was lamenting that designers on the call today, pay heed, that designers really need to start to specify and generate demand for simpler woods, abundant woods. Like, you can really make a difference here in between seeing something like radiata pine just chipped by the tonnage through our cities, and actually seeing this repurposed and reused in our buildings and in our public spaces. So really take that to heart and think about providence and think about the overall impact of your specification choices. We know that there's a style and a trend around what's beautiful timber to use in buildings, but really think about the difference that your specification can make.
There's a beautiful podcast at the moment with a discussion with Sarah Wigglesworth in London, talking about a renovation to her own place, which she has just undertaken. And she was talking, there's many takeouts from that podcast, but one that was really impactful to me was one about how we architects need to focus our creative energies on realizing the aesthetic of these different choices and sort of allowing that to come to bear, and stop sort of thinking that an all glass facade is an okay aesthetic, because guess what, it isn't. And that we need to really sort of, I suppose the scientists and engineers have dominated in this space, and they're not necessarily their skill set isn't so great at realizing the aesthetic potential of a lot of these choices. And I think that's where we need to be focusing a lot of our attention at the moment.
Thank you, Caroline. Obviously, Sarah Wigglesworth said that far better, so thank you. I'd like to invite the group to consider some of the ways that the Greyfield site project can help to deliver overall community benefit. And I know, Stephen, that I think it's Maroondah City Council has actually delivered like benefit back to the broader community through your project. And I thought maybe you could share a little about the detail of that. It does have trees in the summary here, so perhaps that's the link we can build on.
Yeah, so when you sit down with any community, you find out what they want pretty quick. So unlike most local governments, they actually let me as a sociologist in to speak to people. So in the first area, people were really freaked out about the loss of trees. So we said, well, that's going to be critical. Another area, there's flood mitigation. So any developments have to speak to that. We did this in North Reservoir as well, and the residents just felt like they were being ignored. So the architects started drafting a plan so they felt like they were included in a part of the city, reactivating shops. Then there was another area we did it in Hampton. The community benefit there was to start linking up the green space and stuff. So it's just contextual approaches to community co-benefit, getting the additionality or the co-benefit that the community wants and making it part of the precinct. But that's me again. I just want to go back to speak to something Caroline mentioned. When you're talking about nature-based solutions and linking up more nature and having more trees, the really frustrating thing about this is insurance. My insurance goes up if there's a big tree out the front, right? If you speak to the asset manager at Burundara, trees are their biggest liability. They don't want more trees because they're considered a liability. An asset sometimes, but this guy has to write them down as a liability. Trees cost them money. They don't want them. Then there's the land planning issues. Just to have something as simple as a green strip. Do you have the public insurance? If there's too many bushes, will kids loiter there? Will grannies get attacked and bags be stolen? There's just so much legislation about greening stuff. This is why I keep going back to the statutory planning, even though I can't stand statutory stuff. If you don't create the templates so people can do stuff, it's just not going to happen. I've got a few students doing nature-based solutions, a few PhD students linking stuff up. And I tell them, if you don't do statutory somewhere, I'm just going to slap you because it's so significant. The legislative nature of the urban environment just can't be overstated. I hate it, but the legislation needs to be there to promote these things and to say who pays if something blows up, who's going to take the risk, who's going to pay the insurance bill, blah, blah. All the tedious stuff is where it's at, unfortunately. Sorry, rant. Over.
I know, but what a healthy rant. We're just building some momentum here as 11 o'clock looms. I think that some of you may be interested to know that last year when COVID hit, Beyond Zero Emissions, we wrote a plan to deliver 1.8 million jobs in the next 5 years across 7 sectors of the economy, including land. What a shame that we're looking at our urban infrastructure, urban green infrastructure as a cost and not an opportunity to bring people back to work, develop new industries and reconnect people with their local areas and nature. So thank you for your rant. Got me inspired as well. So I'm going to invite Caroline to round out our conversation today with our few minutes left with, I think, a pretty profound question here. So I'd like to know from you first, and then I'll do one last question to everyone. So if a better future is so great, why aren't we doing it?
Such a good question. And I think that it's partly because we've handed over permission to, I mean, we keep asking for permission to do stuff that we should just do. And I think that that's a mindset issue. And we've got we've got to really take control of that, not take control, but really explore the opportunities that we can see and help others see them and move positively in that direction. And I understand all of the legislative issues, but sometimes it's easier to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. And I think that we've got to just kind of take a big mindset and really kind of bring others along with us in that celebration of the potential fabulousness. And sort of get rid of the road engineers and their hatred of trees, just move them to the side and their sort of demand for cars, and move people into the forefront who understand that trees and nature and people walking and cycling and others are where we, and nature together is where we need to focus our attention.
And Stephen?
The reason we're not doing stuff like that is because the engineers usually hold the budget. The engineers can provide the quantitative analysis to prove or disprove anything. Developers have a business which is established and works on small lots. Why change it? Basically, it's economics and the institutional structure of local governments can't do anything much apart from business as usual. It seems to work. Why change it? That's what it comes down to. Small builders control the middle suburbs because they're the ones who can do that business model.
So I'm going to attempt to bring us all back up into a really positive landing page on this. I'll invite all our speakers to take themselves off mute, give or take your construction noise, Stephen. I'm going to invite each of you to let our audience know, what do you think is the most impactful thing that each of us could do right now? So I'll go Paul, Peter, Stephen, then Caro.
Yes, I think engaging locally in our communities where we can is got to be a really important way forward for all of us, because I think the large kind of systems that we've been kind of directed or funneled to, whether we're talking about, I'm so sorry. I had it on mute, but it comes into the computer, sorry. Because these, it's been proven that these larger systems that we seem to be funneled into have so many impacts environmentally and socially that are not good. And by breaking things down, I don't know that it's into smaller systems. I don't believe that it's going backwards in the world, like going back to the past at all. I think it's just a way to move forward in a resilient way that's going to work for these next decades that we have ahead of us, where we need to be very gentle on the planet and gentle with one another. So thank you.
My view is similar, but probably at the slightly higher level. I believe the Institute of Architects, the Planning Institute of Australia, the Landscape Institute, those peak bodies have influence on government. The Sustainable Architecture Forum that I'm part of at the present time is being active, and we've prepared submissions to the Institute, and we're moving through the process, excuse me, of how we can go further. But that's the level. We've got to get the political change and then to start changing from above. But I then still think from down below, if all of us in community can really look at ourselves and say, is selfishness driving a lot of our actions, and start to divest ourselves of just our own interest for that community good, I'm sure it will help the world generally.
Me next?
I think so.
Yeah, just local government has very little capacity, no skills really, apart from business as usual. I reckon the best thing anyone can do is get whatever skills you have and give some time to a local project. You can be an accountant and still be a nice person, if you know what I mean.
Okay, I reckon everyone can go out and plant a plant today. Like just start somewhere and do something, and do it with someone else in the community. And I think, on a sort of higher, or sort of moving up. The other thing is we should get more architects into politics. Go and get onto your local council or stand for state government. And I think that at the moment in state government in New South Wales, they're just delivering a whole raft of things around designing with country, which has been brought on by an Indigenous government architect. And I think that we need to absolutely support that and help show how the implementation of that can be really rich and enriching. So I think we've got to kind of, it's that back to that tend, mend, renew and regenerate is don't just think we have to start afresh, but sort of try and fix what's there. Where it's not possible, do something else, but just kind of help to tend, mend, renew and regenerate wherever, at whatever scale and whatever level we can.
Thank you so much, everyone. We're going to wrap up now with our 4 key messages. Paul says, engage in local communities. Peter says, use your political capital to make change you want to see in bureaucracy. He also says, ask yourself if selfishness is driving your own actions. Stephen, local government, local projects need your skills. So get out there no matter what you have to contribute and help make it a better place. Caroline says, architects become politicians. She says many other great things, and I invite you to stay in touch with all of our presenters online. Thank you again to the Sustainable Architecture Forum, Australian Architects Institute, and Australian Architects Declare for joining us today at this Sustainable Living Festival event. Thank you all for joining us, and especially to our 4 speakers today, Caroline, Paul, Stephen, and Peter. Happy weekend, everybody.